Okay, so today we are tackling a big one, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And to help us unpack it all, we're going way back to 2003.
2003,
Yeah, with this in-depth report from the Carter Center, former President Jimmy Carter's organization.
Right.
It was a really pivotal year.
It was.
I mean, the roadmap for peace had just been put forward, and the world was still grappling with 9/11.
Yeah, you're talking about a pressure cooker of a moment.
Total pressure cooker.
This report, it's like a time capsule. It captures all that intensity, but what's really striking is how many of the dynamics they were analyzing back then are still playing out today.
Okay, so paint us a picture. What was the lay of the land in 2003?
Well, imagine this. Both the Israelis and the Palestinians are dealing with this really deep well of mistrust, decades in the making. And on top of that, they're both facing these huge internal divisions. The report talks about this tug of war between wanting to project strength and wanting to pursue peace.
A real balancing act.
Totally. They even use this phrase, tactical hawks, strategic doves.
Meaning?
So on the surface, it's all about taking a hard line, showing you're tough. But underneath, there's this desire for a solution.
So kind of like people were publicly supporting a tough stance, but privately hoping for a peaceful resolution.
Exactly. So it's unspoken tension, and it made navigating the whole peace process incredibly complex.
I bet. So how did that actually play out? Like, who were the major players on each side, and what were their positions?
Well, on the Israeli side, you had Ariel Sharon, who had just been reelected as prime minister.
Right, the famous general-term politician.
Exactly. And then you had Amram Mitznah, the Labor Party leader, who ran on a peace platform.
So a pretty stark choice for Israeli voters.
You could say that again. And then on the Palestinian side, you had Yasser Arafat still leading the Palestinian Authority.
But he was under a lot of pressure, right?
Immense pressure, especially from the U.S. to implement reforms. There were concerns about corruption, his leadership style, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. So you've got this backdrop of political turmoil on both sides, plus this long history of mistrust. It makes you wonder, how do you even begin to untangle something this complex?
Yeah.
Where do you even start?
That's where this Carter Center report gets really fascinating.
How so?
They didn't just analyze the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in isolation. They looked at other conflicts around the world, almost like using benchmarks to understand how these things tend to unfold.
So they were looking for common patterns, things that tend to pop up in these kinds of conflicts.
Exactly. And they found some pretty striking similarities. For one, peace processes rarely follow a straight line.
Yeah, no kidding.
They often unfold in stages with lots of back and forth agreements, setbacks. It's like navigating a maze blindfolded.
That's a good analogy. You're bumping into walls, taking wrong turns, having to retrace your steps.
Totally. And the report really digs into this idea of spoiler groups.
Spoiler groups. Okay, now you've got my attention. What are we talking about here?
These are groups or factions who actually have a vested interest in keeping the conflict alive.
So they benefit from things not working out.
Exactly. They benefit from the status quo, even if that status quo is pretty awful for everybody else.
And they're willing to actively sabotage the peace process.
Oh, absolutely. And the report goes deeper. It categorizes these spoiler groups as either dealers or zealots.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
So dealers are motivated by more practical concerns, like power resources territory.
So you could potentially bring them to the table with the right incentives, like a little carrot and stick approach.
You got it. But then you have the zealots. These are the ideologically driven groups, the true believers.
Ones who are in it for the cause.
Exactly. And those are much harder to deal with because their identity, their whole worldview is often tied to the conflict itself.
So how do you even begin to make peace when you've got these groups who are basically rooting for things to fail?
Well, the report emphasizes that you can't just ignore them and hope for the best. You have to understand their motivations, figure out ways to neutralize their influence, and in some cases even try to bring them into the fold later in the peace process.
That's got to be a delicate dance.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's not enough to just get the main players to the table. You need a strategy for dealing with all the other actors who might try to throw a wrench in the works.
100%.
All right.
And on top of all that, the report really hammers home the importance of strong leadership.
Makes sense. You need someone who can actually sell those tough compromises to their people, even when it's deeply unpopular.
Right.
Yeah.
You need leaders who can articulate a vision of peace that's more compelling than the status quo.
Yeah.
Even when that status quo is what benefits certain groups.
It's a lot of pressure. It's not just about negotiating a deal. It's about bringing your people along with you.
Absolutely. And that's something this report really underscores, the human element of peacemaking. It's not just about land or borders or settlements. It's about perceptions, emotions, and ultimately trust.
And trust is probably in pretty short supply in a conflict like this. So beyond just analyzing the problem, did the Carter Center actually offer any solutions? So they weren't just armchair analysts, they actually rolled up their sleeves and offered some concrete ideas.
They did, and some of them were pretty out there.
Out there good or out there, what are they smoking?
I'd say more like ahead of their time. For example, they urged Arab states to play a much more active role.
Interesting. What did they have in mind?
Well, they basically said Arab leaders need to use their influence to nudge the Palestinians towards a deal, kind of like peer pressure on a geopolitical scale.
Okay, so not just leaving it to the Israelis and Palestinians themselves, but bringing in the whole neighborhood.
Exactly. They knew that for any agreement to stick, it would need buy-in from the entire region.
Makes sense. So what else did they suggest?
One thing that really jumped out at me was their emphasis on fostering dialogue between everyday Israelis and Palestinians.
So not just the politicians, but regular people.
Exactly. The Carter Center really believed in the power of people-to-people contact to change hearts and minds.
They weren't just talking about kumbaya moments, though, right?
Yeah.
They actually had specific ideas for making this happen.
Oh, absolutely. They proposed things like conflict resolution workshops, media campaigns to challenge stereotypes, even cultural exchanges to build bridges across those dividing lines.
So kind of like a track 2 diplomacy effort running parallel to the official negotiations.
You got it. And they were way ahead of the curve in seeing the potential of citizen-led peace building.
It's actually kind of hopeful when you think about it.
Yeah.
Even amidst all that tension and mistrust, there were people working to bridge the divide from the ground up.
It just goes to show you that peace isn't something that gets imposed from above. It has to be built from the bottom up, too.
Well said. So after this deep dive into the Carter Center report, what are the big takeaways? What should we as engaged citizens be thinking about?
I think the key takeaway is this peace is not a passive outcome. It's not something that just happens to you. It's an active choice that we have to make every single day.
And a choice that requires a whole lot of effort from everybody involved.
Absolutely. But as we've seen from this report, it's an effort worth making. And who knows, maybe by learning from the past and understanding those common threads, we can create a better future.
Here's hoping. That's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.